If you've watched any Space Marine armor breakdown, you've been told that Mark II and Mark III helmets were sealed in place, that Marines couldn't turn their heads. That's straight up, objectively wrong. It was retconned with the Horus Heresy books years ago. The Forge World sourcebooks that accompanied the miniature releases starting in 2012 showed articulated helmets on the Mark II Crusade Armor kit. The Black Library novels depicted Marines in both patterns scanning their surroundings, reacting to threats from multiple directions. The wiki pages still haven't updated. The YouTube videos still repeat the myth. The comment sections still argue about it without anyone bothering to check the actual sources. Welcome to the corpse lore crisis. Here's the situation. Hundreds of thousands of new players just discovered 40K through Space Marine 2. They did what any reasonable person would do. They opened YouTube. They typed Space Marine Armor Explained. They pulled up Lexicanum. They consumed video after video, article after article, believing they were arming themselves with the sacred truth of the Imperium. They weren't. They were drinking from a poisoned well. The lore they absorbed wasn't wrong in the way fan theories are wrong. It was wrong in a more insidious way. It was once correct, decades ago, and has since been explicitly retconned by Games Workshop itself. But nobody told them. Nobody told you. That changes today. This isn't another armor breakdown video. This is a prosecution. We're putting Games Workshop's contradictory lore management on trial. We're putting the wikis on trial. We're putting every content creator who unknowingly spread misinformation on trial. And by the end of this, you'll know the difference between actual canon and the zombie knowledge that refuses to stop walking. You'll be able to cite your sources. You'll never embarrass yourself repeating wiki errors in a comment section again. Let's talk about how we got here. Games Workshop does something no other major franchise does. They've deliberately embraced what insiders call the unreliable narrator framework. Every piece of 40K lore, every codex entry, every Black Library novel, every Forge World supplement is written from the perspective of an imperial scholar, an inquisitorial chronicler, or a chapter historian. These aren't objective observers. They're propagandists. They're zealots. Occasionally, they're liars. Games Workshop has explicitly stated that contradictions in the lore aren't bugs to be patched. They're features to be celebrated. The Imperium is 10,000 years old. It spans 1,000,000 worlds. It's endured catastrophes that would shatter any records. Of course the history is fragmentary. Of course different sources disagree. This is by design. That's clever world building. It also created a monster. Because here's what happens when you build ambiguity into your foundational lore philosophy. When you issue a genuine retcon, when you deliberately update the lore through new sourcebooks and replace old information with new canon, the wiki editors and content creators don't always notice. They can't tell the difference between this contradicts that because 40K is deliberately messy and this contradicts that because the old information is no longer valid. So they continue citing the old sources. They copy-paste from articles that were accurate in 2003. They build definitive breakdown videos using information that died before their channel existed. And the zombie lore spreads. Consider the scale of what we're dealing with. Lexicanum alone contains tens of thousands of articles covering everything from the molecular composition of ceramite armor plating to the dietary habits of Catachan devils. The fandom wiki is equally massive. These resources are indispensable for anyone trying to understand a universe that has been continuously expanded since 1987. But wikis are only as accurate as their sources and their editors. When Forge World releases a new Horus Heresy supplement that quietly revises how Mark III armor works, there's no automated system flagging every wiki article affected by that change. There's no alert sent to every YouTuber who made an armor breakdown video 3 years ago. There's no quality control mechanism ensuring that definitive content actually reflects current canon. The old information just sits there, ossified, treated as gospel by newcomers who have no way of knowing it was superseded years ago. The Space Marine 2 wave made this crisis acute. When a single video game introduces hundreds of thousands of new players to a franchise, those players need onboarding content. They need explanations of what a Space Marine is, how their armor works, why they matter. The content creator ecosystem responds to this demand by producing exactly what's requested: armor breakdown videos, lore explainers, everything you need to know primers. These videos rack up millions of views. They become the de facto introductory curriculum for an entire generation of fans. And if those videos were built on a foundation of corpse lore, if the creator researched by skimming wikis that haven't been updated since the Horus Heresy series started publishing, the misinformation doesn't just persist. It multiplies. It becomes consensus. It becomes what everybody knows. And when someone finally points out that the official canon changed, they're met with disbelief. Surely all those videos couldn't be wrong. Surely the wiki wouldn't lie. But here's the thing. Games Workshop has no quality control mechanism for fan-generated content. They publish the new books, they update the models, and they leave the rest to the warp. So let's perform an autopsy on the helmet mobility myth. Let's establish exactly how zombie lore is born, how it spreads, and how you can identify it in the wild. The fixed helmet claim traces back to the earliest days of 40K lore, when the armor marks were first being distinguished from one another. In the Rogue Trader era and the early codexes that followed, the distinction between armor marks was often cosmetic rather than functional. The lore was sparse. The miniatures were crude by modern standards. Games Workshop wasn't yet building the intricate technical specifications that would later define each pattern. When writers needed to differentiate Mark II Crusade Armor and Mark III Iron Armor from later, more advanced patterns, they emphasized limitations. Mark II was a step up from the crude thunder armor of the Unification Wars, but still primitive. Mark III was specialized for boarding actions and close quarters combat, featuring additional frontal plating at the expense of mobility. Somewhere in this process of differentiation, the fixed helmet detail entered the canon. It made intuitive sense. These were early designs, built before the Mechanicum perfected the articulation systems that would allow full range of motion in later marks. The helmet was bolted to the gorget. The Marine turned his body to look around. End of story. For about 2 decades. Then came the Horus Heresy. When Forge World launched its Horus Heresy game system in 2012, it represented a massive investment in the 30K era. This wasn't a minor supplement. This was an entire parallel game system with its own miniature line, its own rulebooks, and its own sourcebooks providing unprecedented technical specifications for every piece of Astartes wargear. The company began producing detailed resin miniature kits for each armor mark, accompanied by sourcebooks called the Horus Heresy series, colloquially known as the Black Books, that provided the definitive reference materials for the game. These weren't casual lore books written for entertainment. They were engineering documents for hobbyists who would be building and painting these models, requiring internal consistency and logic that could withstand scrutiny from thousands of detail-obsessed fans. And when Forge World's designers created the Mark II Crusade Armor kit, they made the helmet articulated. It could rotate on the model. The sourcebook did not include any mention of fixed helmets. The limitation was quietly removed from canon. This was not an oversight. Forge World kits are designed with obsessive attention to detail, with every component justified by lore. If the helmet were canonically fixed, the kit would reflect that restriction. The kit doesn't reflect that. The accompanying fluff doesn't mention the restriction. In the years since, Black Library novels set during the Heresy have depicted Marines in Mark II and Mark III armor turning their heads, scanning their surroundings, reacting to threats from multiple directions without any mention of physical limitations. The evidence is overwhelming. The fixed helmet restriction is dead lore. It was a detail from an earlier, less developed version of the canon, superseded by decades of subsequent material that explicitly contradicts it. Yet, as of this writing, the wikis still perpetuate it. The YouTube videos still repeat it. The comment sections still argue about it without anyone bothering to check the actual Forge World sourcebooks that have been available for over a decade. This is zombie knowledge in its purest form, a fact that died years ago but refuses to stop walking. And it's just the beginning. The helmet mobility myth isn't merely an interesting piece of trivia. It's the canary in the coal mine. It's proof that the most widely circulated 40K lore content is built on sources that no longer reflect the official canon. If content creators got something this basic wrong, something that could be verified by purchasing a single Forge World supplement, what else have they gotten wrong? The answer is disturbingly extensive. Let's talk about those studs. When you look at Mark V Heresy armor, you see those distinctive riveted studs covering the helmet, the shoulder pads, the torso. The aesthetic is deliberately crude, evoking images of jury-rigged equipment hammered together in the chaos of civil war. For years, the dominant explanation circulating in fan communities was that these studs served as ablative armor, small sacrificial elements designed to deflect incoming fire. The interpretation fit the visual language perfectly. It felt right. It made the armor look like it had a purpose beyond mere aesthetics. It also happens to be wrong. The actual function of molecular bonding studs, as confirmed by official Warhammer community sources and the Forge World Heresy books, is considerably more mundane. They're rivets, engineering rivets. Specifically, they're attachment points used to hold extra layers of ceramite plating over older, more vulnerable armor components. When the Horus Heresy erupted, the supply lines that fed the Legiones Astartes fractured catastrophically. Forge worlds burned. Manufacturing temples were besieged. Legion armorers found themselves with warehouses full of damaged armor components, but no replacement parts matching the original specifications. The Great Crusade had stretched Imperial logistics to the breaking point even before the Civil War. Now, with half the legions turning traitor and the other half scrambling to respond, there was no centralized supply chain left. The solution was improvisation. Armorers took whatever components they had available, often mixed pieces from multiple marks, salvaged from fallen brothers, repaired with whatever materials the forge could provide, and reinforced them by bonding additional ceramite plates to the exterior. The studs are what hold those plates in place. They're not ablative. They're not designed to deflect anything. They're the screws holding a desperate repair together. And the reason Mark V looks so crude is because it was never meant to be a standardized pattern. It was a field modification that became so widespread during the heresy that historians later cataloged it as its own mark. Every suit of Mark V armor is essentially a custom job, built from whatever the armorer had on hand, reinforced with whatever could be scavenged or fabricated under wartime conditions. Here's the detail that nobody tells you, the detail that proves the official sources know exactly what they're talking about. By the time the Mark VI armor generation appeared, the molecular bonding studs were traditionally localized to the left shoulder plate specifically. This wasn't an aesthetic choice. Analysis of combat data indicated that the left side of an advancing Marine took the most enemy fire. Think about how a Space Marine fights. When you advance with your bolter braced, your left shoulder leads. You're firing from the hip or from a supported position, moving forward into enemy positions, and your left side is the one facing the threat. When you engage in close combat with a sword, your left shoulder presents to the enemy as you strike. When you raise a combat shield, it's in your left hand, covering your left side. The left pauldron was the component most likely to be damaged, and therefore the component most likely to need reinforcement and modular replacement. The studs clustered there because that was where the extra ceramite was most needed. The armorers weren't decorating. They were solving an engineering problem created by the realities of combat. This is fantastic lore, logical, grim, entirely consistent with the Imperium's brutal efficiency. And it's almost never mentioned in breakdown videos because the creators haven't read the actual sources. They learned from wikis that learned from older wikis that learned from codexes published before Forge World existed. So when someone in your comment section smugly insists the studs are ablative armor and you're an idiot for thinking they're rivets, you now have the ammunition to prove them wrong. Point them to the Forge World Heresy sourcebooks. Point them to the official Warhammer community articles. Point them to the left shoulder concentration detail that only makes sense if the studs are attachment points rather than armor in their own right. Watch them go silent. That's what weaponized knowledge looks like. But understanding the studs requires understanding what the armorers were actually dealing with during the heresy. Let's look at a specific example: the Iron Warriors at the Siege of Terra. By 014.M31, the Iron Warriors Legion had been fighting continuously for 7 years of civil war. Their supply lines to compliant Forge Worlds had been severed when the War Master turned traitor. The massive casualties of the Drop Site Massacre, the grinding attrition of the Shadow Crusade, and the endless sieges that followed had depleted their equipment reserves to critical levels. When Perturabo's Iron Warriors arrived at Terra for the final siege, their armor bore the scars of that journey. Legion serfs recorded suits comprising components from 4 different marks: a Mark III torso, Mark II greaves, Mark IV gauntlets, and a helmet salvaged from a dead brother whose Legion affiliation had been deliberately filed away. The molecular bonding studs covered every surface where additional ceramite had been welded to fill battle damage or reinforce weakened joints. These weren't parade ground Marines in matching equipment. These were survivors wearing the stitched-together remnants of 100 dead brothers' armor. The studs weren't decoration. They were the literal stitches holding their protection together. That visual, that history, is what Mark V represents. And it's why the ablative armor theory never made sense to anyone who actually read the Heresy sourcebooks. Ablative armor is a deliberate design choice. Mark V was desperation made manifest. Now let's demolish something bigger. Let's talk about the sacred relic lie. If you've absorbed any amount of 40K lore, you've been told that power armor is precious beyond measure. You've heard descriptions of armor suits passed down through centuries of chapter history, each bearing the battle damage and honorific markings of every Marine who wore it. You've read about elaborate rituals performed to appease the machine spirit dwelling within the armor's systems, coaxing ancient technology to function for one more battle. You've learned that recovering a fallen brother's armor is sometimes prioritized over recovering the brother himself, because the armor is irreplaceable and Marines are merely expensive. This is compelling world building. It emphasizes the Imperium's technological decay. It highlights the religious relationship with machinery that defines the Adeptus Mechanicus. It underscores the scarcity that drives so much of 40K's conflict. When every suit of armor represents centuries of history, every battle becomes more meaningful. Every loss becomes more tragic. It's also directly and flagrantly contradicted by the Primaris Marines. When Archmagos Belisarius Cawl was finally allowed to unveil his 10,000-year project to Robute Guilliman, he didn't present a handful of experimental prototypes for deployment. The Ultima Founding for deployment. The Ultima Founding created entire new chapters at a stroke and reinforced existing chapters with hundreds of new warriors. Each of these Primaris Marines required a suit of Mark X armor. Cawl didn't raid 10,000 reliquaries to outfit them. He didn't petition 100 chapters to donate their sacred relics. He manufactured the armor, on an industrial scale, for 10 millennia. While the Imperium was busy telling itself that power armor was a finite resource grown scarcer with each passing century, Cawl was running production lines in his hidden laboratories on Mars. The Mark X Tacticus, Gravis, and Phobos variants aren't sacred relics tended by generations of tech priests. They're standardized components stamped out in quantities sufficient to equip a crusade. This is the contradiction that demolishes the power armor is rare narrative. Games Workshop wants both versions of the lore to be true simultaneously. They want the gravitas of sacred relics tended by tech priests who alone understand the mysteries of the machine spirit. They also want the spectacle of Guilliman unleashing wave after wave of identical Primaris warriors in factory-fresh armor. Both themes appear in official publications. Both are treated as canon. Both cannot logically coexist. Unless you accept one of two conclusions. Either Games Workshop doesn't care about internal consistency, or they expect readers to accept that different parts of the Imperium operate under completely different rules. Perhaps Call is simply that much more advanced than every other Forge world. Perhaps his facilities represent a capability lost everywhere else. Perhaps the rest of the Mechanicus simply forgot how to do something that one man remembered. But if that's the case, why has no one in 10,000 years tried to replicate his methods? Why is the Imperium not stripping his labs for every scrap of data they contain? Why isn't Call the most important person in the Imperium, with every tech priest in the galaxy trying to learn his secrets? The answer is that Games Workshop didn't think through the implications when they introduced the Primaris. They wanted a narrative reason to sell new miniatures. They wanted existing players to buy new armies. The story served the business model, not the other way around. Now the lore contains a gaping wound that no amount of wiki editing can heal. The maintenance rituals tell the real story of this contradiction. Visit a chapter's armorium before the Primaris era, and you'd witness ceremonies that had remained unchanged for millennia. The Rite of Awakening began every armor maintenance cycle. A tech marine would approach a suit of Mark VII Aquila armor in the pre-dawn darkness, servo-skull familiars hovering at his shoulders, with incense burners filling the air with sanctified promethium fumes. He would speak the litany of appeasement in binaric cant, a stream of machine code prayers that could take 6 hours to complete, depending on the armor's age and the complexity of its machine spirit. Sacred unguents derived from the rendered fat of martyred chapter serfs would be applied to every joint interface. The oils weren't symbolic. They contained suspended molecules of blessed metals that the Mechanicum claimed improved conductivity between organic neural tissue and the armor's haptic systems. Whether this was superstition or genuine technology lost to time, no one could say with certainty. The Tech Marines applied them anyway. They had been applying them for 10,000 years. Each battle scar on the ceramite would be cataloged, cross-referenced against chapter records, and either preserved as an honorific mark or repaired with materials blessed by the Fabricator General's representatives. A single suit of Mark VI armor in the Raven Guard's armorium bore 217 cataloged battle scars, each one corresponding to a specific engagement dating back to the heresy itself. Removing those scars would be tantamount to destroying chapter history. The full maintenance cycle for a single suit of pre-Primaris armor could take 3 days. Now contrast that with Mark X. Call designed the Mark X system for modularity and rapid deployment. The armor's diagnostic systems can be interfaced directly with standard Mechanicum data looms. No binaric prayers required. The machine's status displays in clear Gothic text. The maintenance protocols fit on a single data slate. A trained chapter serf can perform basic repairs. A tech marine can cycle through a dozen suits in the time it took to properly maintain a single Mark VII. The sacred has been replaced by the efficient. And somewhere in that transition, the soul of what made Space Marine armor meaningful was lost. The lore hasn't reconciled this. It can't. You can't have both, armor as holy relic and armor as military equipment. Games Workshop published both narratives and left the audience to sort out which one actually applies. That's the GW experience in miniature. Pun intended, you're welcome. Now here's where we get into territory that most armor breakdowns skip entirely. Not because it's unimportant, because it doesn't fit their format. When creators structure their videos as chronological mark-by-mark walkthroughs, they begin with Thunder armor, progress through marks 1 through 8, and conclude with a brief mention of Primaris patterns. This structure creates the illusion of comprehensive coverage while quietly omitting several significant categories that don't fit the neat progression. Scout armor is the most glaring omission. The community has asked for coverage of Scout armor repeatedly. Comments across dozens of 40K videos express frustration that creators skip this topic entirely. This isn't a niche request. This is a significant portion of the audience noticing something important was forgotten. Here's why creators skip it. Scout armor isn't power armor. It's a fundamentally different technology with different capabilities and different requirements. When a Space Marine initiate earns his place in the Scout Company, he doesn't receive a suit of power armor with training wheels. He doesn't get a beginner version of the same equipment his veteran brothers wear. He receives something entirely different. A modified suit of Imperial Carapace armor made of hardened ceramite, reinforced body glove, and integrated sensor systems. This is the same class of protection worn by inquisitorial stormtroopers. Elite human soldiers certainly, but human nonetheless. The armor provides excellent protection by human standards. It incorporates advanced materials and sensory enhancements, but it is not power armor in any meaningful sense. There are no servo motors amplifying the wearer's strength. There is no neural interface allowing thought-controlled movement. There is no machine spirit dwelling within the systems. The distinction exists because of the black carapace. The black carapace is the final crowning implant that transforms a Space Marine initiate into a full battle brother. It's a layer of specifically designed thermoplastic that is surgically grafted directly onto the Marine's torso, covering the hard points where power armor connections interface with the body. Once implanted, the black carapace allows the Marine's nervous system to link directly with his armor's systems. The armor becomes an extension of his body rather than equipment he's wearing. Without the black carapace, a standard human would be incinerated by the neural reactive interface of true power armor. The feedback systems would overwhelm an unmodified nervous system. The power requirements would draw energy the body cannot provide. The armor would kill the person trying to wear it. The scout must earn his way to that upgrade. After decades of combat as a light infantry specialist, after proving himself in hundreds of engagements, demonstrating the discipline and tactical acumen required of a full battle brother, the scout undergoes the final surgery. The black carapace is grafted onto his body. And only then does he receive his first suit of true power armor. This distinction matters because it changes how you should understand the Space Marine progression. A scout isn't simply a Marine in weaker armor. A scout is an unfinished Marine, genetically modified, enhanced with 17 of the 19 implants that define an Astartes, trained to superhuman standards, but not yet completed. The carapace armor he wears represents the best protection a body without a black carapace can interface with. It's not a limitation imposed by the chapter being stingy with equipment. It's a biological limitation that cannot be overcome until the Marine's body is ready for the final implant. Consider the third company of the Ultramarines during the Tyrannic Wars. Scout Sergeant Tellian led reconnaissance operations on Macragge itself during the High Fleet Behemoth invasion. His scout squads operated for weeks behind Tyranid bioswarm lines, gathering intelligence that would prove critical to the defense of the polar fortresses. They did this in carapace armor, not because the chapter couldn't spare power armor, but because scout armor's lighter weight and reduced power signature made it ideal for infiltration work. The scouts weren't inferior warriors stuck with inferior equipment. They were specialists using the right tool for their mission profile. Their armor wasn't a stepping stone to something better. It was purpose-built for what they needed to do. That's significant Astartes lore that gets completely flattened when creators skip scout armor because it doesn't fit the Mark numbering system. They either ignore scouts entirely or make vague references to light armor without explaining what that actually means. Now you know. And now you can correct anyone who dismisses scout armor as just weaker power armor. It's not. It's a completely different relationship between Marine and equipment, and the black carapace is the threshold between them. While we're covering what others skip, Centurion warsuits. They're included in some breakdowns, but almost always mischaracterized. The Centurion is not a separate type of power armor. It's not the next step up from Terminator armor. It's not a vehicle the Marine pilots. It's an exoskeleton worn over power armor. A Space Marine piloting a Centurion suit is wearing his normal Mark VII or Mark VIII armor, then climbing into a massive hydraulic frame that amplifies his strength and carries weapon systems too heavy for standard infantry use. The Marine inside still has his personal armor's protection. The Centurion adds to that protection with additional armored plating, but its primary purpose isn't defense, it's firepower. Understanding this relationship matters for any discussion of Astartes' tactical flexibility. A Centurion-equipped Marine isn't locked into his warsuit for the duration of a campaign. He can dismount, fight in standard armor, and remount as the tactical situation demands. The Centurion is a piece of specialist equipment, not a permanent assignment. When the mission requires overwhelming ranged firepower, the Centurion provides it. When the mission requires mobility and speed, the Marine leaves the warsuit behind and fights in his standard armor. The Centurion comes in two primary variants, each optimized for different combat roles. The Centurion Devastator configuration emphasizes ranged firepower at the expense of everything else. It mounts heavy weapon systems typically reserved for vehicles or fortification emplacements, las cannons, grav cannons, heavy bolters, on a frame that can be deployed by infantry and moved with infantry. When a chapter needs to crack open a bunker but can't get armor support to the target, Centurion Devastators provide the firepower. The Battle of Raukos demonstrated this capability perfectly. Imperial Fist Centurion squads advanced through tunnel systems too narrow for Predator tanks, carrying firepower equivalent to an armored column. When they reached the Orc war boss's command bunker, they unleashed a concentrated barrage that would have required 3 Leman Russ battle tanks to replicate. The Orcs never expected that kind of firepower from infantry. They paid for that mistake. The Centurion assault configuration takes the same frame and optimizes it for close combat. It mounts siege drills capable of tearing through fortification walls, flamers for clearing confined spaces, and additional armor plating to survive the approach into melee range. When a chapter needs to breach hardened positions and engage the defenders in close quarters, Centurion assault squads lead the breach. The trade-offs are severe in both configurations. Centurions sacrifice mobility for capability. The hydraulic frame is slower than standard power armor, less maneuverable, harder to deploy through restricted terrain. A Centurion cannot fit through a standard doorway. A Centurion cannot navigate the tight confines of a starship's corridors. A Centurion cannot redeploy quickly when tactical conditions change. But when you need to deliver las cannon tier firepower on an infantry frame, when you need to crack fortifications without calling in armor support, when you need a walking weapons platform that can still fit through a breach, the Centurion earns its reputation. The armor over armor setup also explains why Centurion pilots are selected from experienced veterans rather than assigned randomly. The cognitive load of managing 2 nested systems simultaneously requires exceptional mental discipline. The Marine isn't just operating his power armor. He's operating his power armor while simultaneously interfacing with the Centurion's hydraulic systems, weapons targeting, and sensor feeds. It's like patting your head and rubbing your stomach, except the stakes are considerably higher than looking foolish at a party. And then there's the Grey Knights. The Grey Knights wear unnumbered pattern armor, and the community has consistently asked about it. This is niche territory. This is where you prove you're not just covering the mainstream stuff that everyone else covers. Grey Knight's armor doesn't have a mark number. Their equipment is designated Aegis armor, and it operates under completely different rules than standard Astartes equipment. The Grey Knights are the chamber militant of the Ordo Malleus, the inquisitorial branch that hunts demons. Their entire existence is classified at the highest levels of Imperial security. Their recruitment, their training, their equipment, all of it operates outside normal Imperial channels. Most Imperial citizens don't know the Grey Knights exist. Most Space Marine chapters have never heard of them. The Inquisition maintains this secrecy through any means necessary, including mind-wiping entire populations who witness Grey Knights in action. Aegis armor isn't just physically protective, it's psychically protective. Every component incorporates hexagrammic wards and sanctified materials designed to shield the wearer from demonic corruption. The sacred inscriptions aren't decorative. The silver-gray coloring isn't aesthetic preference. The elaborate iconography isn't mere tradition. Every element serves the same purpose, protecting the Marine's soul. The armor's machine spirit is unique among Astartes' equipment, specifically conditioned to resist possession, to reject the whispers of the warp, to remain loyal to its wearer even when subjected to demonic assault. Standard Space Marine power armor, exposed to sufficient demonic energy, can be corrupted. The machine spirit can be subverted. The armor can turn against its wearer, seizing up at critical moments, feeding false data to the displays, opening vulnerabilities for the demon to exploit. Aegis armor cannot be corrupted, or at least that's the theory. The Grey Knights guard their secrets jealously, and the full specifications of Aegis armor remain beyond the reach of even most inquisitors. What's clear is that the lack of a mark number isn't an oversight or a gap in the lore. It's a statement. Grey Knights operate outside the system that produced Marks 1 through 10. Their equipment answers to no designation but their own. During the First War for Armageddon in 444 M41, Grey Knights deployed in force against the demonic incursion led by Angron, demon primarch of the World Eaters. The Grey Knights Brotherhood that faced Angron's host wore Aegis armor that had been specifically consecrated for this engagement. Additional wards layered over the standard protections, relics of past demon banishments incorporated into the armor's structure, prayers inscribed in microscopic text across every ceramite surface. When the demon's psychic assault washed over the Imperial lines, standard Astartes armor provided no protection. Marines from multiple chapters fell to demonic possession, their armor becoming prisons for warp entities that turned the Marines' bodies against their former allies. The Grey Knights remained uncorrupted. Their Aegis armor held against a demon primarch's direct influence. That's why they don't get a mark number. Mark numbers are for armor developed through standard Mechanicum channels, subject to the same design processes and material specifications as every other pattern. Aegis armor was developed for a threat so severe that normal rules don't apply. For your next lore argument, that's the distinction that matters. Standard Astartes armor follows the mark progression because it was developed through conventional Imperial channels. Grey Knight's armor doesn't follow the progression because it was developed in secret for a purpose so specialized that conventional rules would only get in the way. Now, let's talk about Mark 9. And let me be very careful here. What I'm about to tell you is not something the Inquisition wants discussed openly. The following information has been compiled from fragmentary sources, cross-referenced against records that, according to official channels, do not exist. Mark 9 armor is classified, not in the casual sense that most Imperial technology is classified. Not the standard, knowledge is power, guard it well, Mechanicum attitude toward proprietary technology. We're talking active suppression. References to Mark 9 in historical documents have been excised. Tech priests who asked too many questions about the gap between Mark 8 and Mark 10 have been reassigned permanently. Here's what we can piece together. Mark 8 errant armor was finalized and entered limited production in the early 41st millennium. The Codex Space Marines, from various editions, confirms its existence and specifications. Mark 10, Tacticus, Gravis, and Phobos were unveiled alongside the Primaris Marines following the Indomitus Crusade in 999.M41. The Mark 10 designation was publicly announced, documented in official Codex publications, and is worn openly by Primaris Marines across the Imperium. Between Mark 8 and Mark 10 sits a void, a numbered designation that officially corresponds to nothing. The timeline is damning. From the formalization of Mark I Thunder Armor during the Unification Wars through Mark 8 in the 41st millennium, every single mark number has been accounted for in official records. The Mechanicum is obsessive about documentation. Every Forge World maintains archives going back thousands of years. Every design iteration is cataloged, tested, recorded. The progression from Mark I to Mark VIII is meticulously documented, with detailed explanations of what each mark improved, why those improvements were made, which forge worlds contributed to the design, and which legions or chapters first received the pattern. Mark X is documented as Call's revolutionary new design, developed in secret over 10,000 years and unveiled alongside the Primaris Marines. Mark IX appears nowhere. The Lexicanum wiki, that same Lexicanum we've been criticizing for perpetuating zombie lore, correctly notes that Mark IX is unaccounted for. They don't speculate about what it might be, they simply acknowledge the gap. The fandom wiki does the same. Neither resource attempts to fill the void with fabrication. This is unusual. Both wikis are typically eager to document every scrap of lore they can find. The fact that they've both explicitly noted the absence rather than attempting to explain it suggests that the absence is genuine, that there truly are no official sources explaining what Mark IX is or was. The implication is unavoidable. Something was developed, something was designated, and then something was suppressed. The theories are numerous, and I'll present them without claiming any as definitive truth. The first theory: Mark IX was a failed pattern. Engineering dead ends happen. The Mechanicum's archives contain thousands of abandoned projects, weapons that worked in theory but failed in production, vehicles that proved too expensive to manufacture, armor patterns that introduced flaws worse than the problems they solved. Perhaps Mark IX represented an ambitious design that proved impossible to mass produce. Perhaps the materials required were too scarce, found only on worlds that were lost during one of the Imperium's many catastrophes. Perhaps the pattern introduced a critical flaw that only manifested under specific combat conditions. Armor that performed perfectly in training, but catastrophically failed against certain Xenos or demonic threats. If Mark IX was simply a failed pattern, the Mechanicum would typically document that failure. They would record what went wrong, why the project was abandoned, what lessons were learned. The absence of any such documentation suggests that the failure, if failure it was, involved something the Mechanicum wants forgotten. The second theory: forbidden technology. The Imperium maintains extensive prohibitions on certain categories of technology. Artificial intelligence is banned. The Men of Iron rebellion that nearly destroyed humanity during the Age of Strife left a cultural wound that never healed. Xenos technology is prohibited. The weapons of the enemy carry both physical and spiritual contamination. Warp-tainted materials are forbidden. The tools of chaos corrupt all who use them. Perhaps Mark IX incorporated something that crossed one of these lines. Imagine an armor pattern that integrated captured alien technology, a Xenos alloy that provided superior protection, or a sensor system that outperformed anything the Mechanicum could produce indigenously. The armor worked. It worked better than anything before it. And then the Inquisition discovered what it was made of, and every suit was destroyed. Every record was burned. Every tech priest who knew the truth was silenced. Or imagine something darker, an armor pattern that interfaced with the warp in ways the Mechanicum didn't fully understand. Not chaos corruption, but something adjacent. Protection systems that drew on psychic energy. Combat stimulants that connected the Marine to something beyond normal space. The armor worked. It worked too well. And whoever authorized its destruction decided that some capabilities are worse than vulnerability. The third theory: chapters that no longer exist. The Imperium does not discuss its failures. When a Space Marine chapter falls to chaos, their records are purged. When a chapter is destroyed by external enemies, their history is often suppressed to deny the Imperium's enemies a propaganda victory. When a chapter commits some sin so severe that the Inquisition destroys them entirely, even the fact of their existence can be erased from Imperial records. 21 Space Marine chapters are listed in official records as having been destroyed or having turned traitor since the Horus Heresy. These are the ones the Imperium acknowledges. The actual number is certainly higher. Some chapters simply vanish from the records with no explanation, present in one century's census, absent from the next, with no documentation of what happened to them. Perhaps Mark IX was the exclusive armor of one of these vanished chapters. Perhaps the armor itself was fine, but the chapter that wore it committed some act so heinous that everything associated with them had to be destroyed, including the armor designation they had pioneered. The fourth theory: Cawl is lying. Archmagos Belisarius Cawl spent 10,000 years developing the Primaris Marines in secret. He claims to have created Mark X armor as part of that project, an entirely new design developed in isolation from the rest of the Mechanicum. But what if Mark X isn't as original as Cawl claims? What if Mark IX existed, and Cawl suppressed knowledge of it to claim credit for innovations that weren't entirely his own? This theory is more speculative than the others. Cawl is the only living authority on Primaris technology, and contradicting him would require evidence that doesn't exist. But the Mechanicum has a long history of tech priests claiming credit for work they didn't do, of hoarding knowledge to maintain political power, of erasing competitors' contributions from the historical record. If anyone had the capability to make an entire armor mark disappear from history, it would be someone with Cawl's resources and influence. What's consistent across all the theories is this: the Inquisition does not want you asking about Mark IX. I've presented what can be reasonably inferred from the absence of information. I've been careful not to invent details that don't exist in any source. What I can tell you is that the gap exists. What I can tell you is that the absence is acknowledged in the numbering system itself. Draw your own conclusions. Be careful who you discuss them with. We now return to topics less likely to attract inquisitorial attention. Let's walk through the marks that do have documented history, because the details matter. These aren't just aesthetic variants. Each mark tells a story about the era that produced it, the enemies it was designed to fight, and the compromises that had to be made. Mark I Thunder Armor, technically not true power armor at all. The suits worn by the Thunder Warriors during the Unification Wars were crude things, the first attempt at creating powered infantry protection. They lacked the environmental sealing that would allow a warrior to fight in hard vacuum. They lacked the sophisticated interface systems that would allow armor to respond to the wearer's thoughts. They were powered by unstable generators that could and did kill their wearers when damaged. The Thunder Warriors who wore this armor fought in the Unification Wars on Terra itself, grinding through the fortress cities of techno-barbarian warlords and the gene cults of the Pan-Pacific Empire. The armor was sufficient for Terra's atmosphere. It didn't need void sealing. It was designed for one purpose: conquering a single planet. When that purpose was achieved, the Thunder Warriors were discarded, and their armor designs were abandoned in favor of something better. Thunder armor gets its own designation more for historical completeness than because it belongs in the same category as later marks. But it represents the starting point, the proof of concept that would eventually evolve into the armor of the Legiones Astartes. Mark II Crusade Armor was the first true Space Marine power armor. Developed for the Great Crusade that would carry the Imperium's forces beyond Terra and into the galaxy, it incorporated everything the Mechanicum had learned from the Thunder Armor experiments. Full environmental sealing allowed Marines to fight in any atmosphere or none at all. Integrated power systems provided reliable energy without the instability of earlier designs. Neural interfaces, enabled by the black carapace, allowed the armor to respond to the wearer's intentions. The distinctive cables running from the backpack to various points on the armor weren't a flaw. They were a necessity of the design era. The technology to run power and data connections through the armor plates themselves hadn't been developed yet. The cables represented the best solution available, and while they created potential weak points, they also allowed for easy field repair. A damaged cable could be replaced by a Legion armorer in the field. Damaged internal conduits required returning to a forge. During the compliance of 119.6, elements of the Luna Wolves encountered a Xeno species that specifically targeted those external cables. The alien creatures, small, fast, with manipulator appendages designed for cutting, swarmed over advancing Marines and severed power cables before the Marines could react. Power armor without power is dead weight. The Marines fell, unable to move in their suddenly inert armor, and were slaughtered. The incident was classified, but it informed the design priorities for later marks. Internal cabling became a priority. The vulnerability was remembered. Mark III iron armor was the first specialized variant, designed for boarding actions and close-quarters combat. When the Great Crusade encountered species that fought primarily in void warfare, when the enemy held space stations and orbital platforms rather than planetary surfaces, the legions needed armor optimized for those specific conditions. Boarding actions are different from planetary warfare. The corridors are narrow. The defenders know the terrain. Fire is concentrated from known positions. You can't flank. You can't maneuver. You advance into prepared kill zones, and you survive through raw protection rather than tactical flexibility. Mark III addressed this reality by accepting trade-offs that would be unacceptable in other contexts. The frontal armor was dramatically increased. Additional ceramite layers that could absorb concentrated fire from defensive positions. The helmet was redesigned with a narrower visor, reducing the vulnerable viewport while accepting reduced peripheral vision. The weight distribution shifted forward, making the armor slower and less maneuverable, but better able to absorb impacts from the front. Marines wearing Mark III during the boarding of the Terminus Est described the experience as becoming a battering ram. You stopped thinking about individual combat. You became part of a formation, a wall of ceramite advancing down a corridor, absorbing fire that would destroy lighter armor, creating space for the Marines behind you to advance. The weight didn't matter because you weren't maneuvering. You were simply moving forward until you reached the enemy or they broke. Mark IV Maximus armor represented the height of pre-heresy technology. Developed during the later stages of the Great Crusade, when the Imperium had access to resources and manufacturing capacity it would never see again, Mark IV incorporated everything the Mechanicum had learned across centuries of war. The external cables of earlier marks were internalized. The power systems were more efficient. The armor plates provided equal protection with less weight. The Great Crusade was won in Mark IV. The final battles against the largest Orc empires, the most sophisticated Xenos civilizations, the last holdouts of human independence. These were fought by legions equipped predominantly with Mark IV. When the Crusade ended and the legions returned to their homeworlds, they returned in the finest armor the Imperium had ever produced. If the heresy hadn't happened, Mark IV would likely have become the standard pattern for millennia. It was that good. The design had no significant flaws that demanded replacement. The manufacturing process was well established across hundreds of forge worlds. The supply chain existed to maintain and repair existing suits indefinitely. But the heresy did happen, and everything changed. Mark V heresy armor was never supposed to exist. We've covered this already, but it bears repeating. Mark V is not a design. It's a category. It's what you call armor that doesn't fit any other classification. Mixed components, field repairs, improvised reinforcement, studs holding extra ceramite over damaged plates. Every suit of Mark V is different because there was no standardized template. There was only desperation. The Sons of Horus at the Siege of Terra wore Mark V that incorporated components from Loyalist Dead, Luna Wolves armor mixed with Iron Hands, Ultramarines, and a dozen other legions. They didn't care about the symbolism. They cared about survival. If a fallen Loyalist pauldron would fit and provide protection, they took it. The studs held it in place. The heresy of wearing your enemy's equipment was nothing compared to the heresy they had already committed. Mark VI Corvus armor was developed during the heresy by Loyalist forces specifically to address the limitations of earlier marks while working within the constrained resources available. The Mechanicum forges still loyal to Terra had to produce armor quickly, efficiently, and with materials that were increasingly scarce as traitor forces disrupted supply lines. The distinctive beaked helmet wasn't just aesthetic. It housed enhanced sensor systems and a reinforced respirator designed to function even when other systems failed. The design prioritized redundancy. If the main power systems were damaged, secondary systems could maintain basic function. If communications were jammed, local sensors could still provide tactical awareness. If everything else failed, the Marine could still breathe. Mark VI saw extensive use by the Raven Guard Legion, whose combat doctrine emphasized speed, stealth, and survivability over raw firepower. After the catastrophic losses at the drop site massacre, where the Raven Guard lost approximately 75% of their Legion's strength in a single battle, the survivors needed armor that would help them fight a different kind of war. Not the massed assaults of the Great Crusade, but guerrilla operations. Hit and fade. Strike the supply lines. Disappear before the enemy could respond. Mark VI was perfect for that role. Lighter than Mark IV, quieter than Mark III, with sensor systems that could detect enemies before being detected in return. The Raven Guard would continue using Mark VI variants long after other chapters had moved on to later patterns, because no subsequent design matched its suitability for their way of war. Mark VII Aquila armor is the one you've seen most often. It's the default Space Marine armor in most Games Workshop artwork, the pattern that most chapters wear in most depictions, the armor that says Space Marine to most fans. Developed after the Heresy, Mark VII incorporated lessons learned from the Civil War while being designed for manufacture in the recovering Imperium. The most visible change was the collar, a raised gorget that protected the neck without restricting helmet movement. Earlier marks had vulnerable joint areas between helmet and torso that traitor forces had learned to exploit. Mark VII addressed this with integrated protection. Note, this confirms that helmet mobility was always the design intent. The Mark VII improvements don't make sense if earlier marks had fixed helmets. You don't improve mobility on a joint that wasn't supposed to move. Mark VII also featured the Aquila, the Imperial Eagle, on the chest plate. This wasn't just decoration, it was a statement of loyalty. In the aftermath of a civil war that saw half the legions turn traitor, wearing the symbol of the Emperor on your chest was a declaration. You couldn't be mistaken for a traitor when you bore the Aquila. You couldn't claim ignorance of which side you served. Mark VIII Errant Armor was the final pre-Primaris pattern, incorporating incremental improvements to the Mark VII design. The most significant change was an enhanced gorget that provided even better neck protection. Though it sacrificed some of the helmet's range of motion, a deliberate trade-off, not a limitation of the technology. Additional armor plating over vulnerable joint areas addressed weaknesses that enemies had exploited over millennia of combat. Mark VIII was never produced in large quantities. The resources required for manufacture limited its distribution to veterans and officers in most chapters. This relative rarity is part of why Mark VII remains the most common pattern. Most chapters simply don't have the manufacturing capacity or the materials to fully equip themselves with Mark VIII. And then came Mark X. Mark X. Tacticus, Gravis, and Phobos represent Call's revolutionary approach to armor design. Rather than a single pattern meant to serve all purposes, Mark X is modular. The same Marine can wear Tacticus configuration for standard combat, switch to Gravis for heavy assault missions, and use Phobos for stealth operations. The underlying armor systems are compatible across configurations. Only the external plating and integrated equipment change. This modularity directly contradicts the sacred relic narrative. Sacred relics don't get swapped out between missions. Sacred relics don't come in interchangeable configurations. Sacred relics are maintained in the same form for centuries. Mark X isn't a sacred relic. Mark X is equipment. Sophisticated, effective, mass-produced equipment. Let's lighten the mood with something absurd, because if this video has felt like a lecture, like a stern senior fan wagging his finger at the mistakes of his juniors, then we've failed at half our mission. 40K lore is ridiculous, intentionally, beautifully ridiculous. The same universe that provides meticulously detailed armor specifications also provides moments of such over-the-top absurdity that the only appropriate response is laughter. Terminator armor durability is where this absurdity reaches its peak. You've heard that Terminator armor is tough. the heaviest protection available to a space marine outside of a vehicle, capable of shrugging off weapons that would vaporize standard infantry, designed for the most dangerous combat environments the galaxy can offer. But the durability feats in official lore go beyond tough into territory that would make a physicist weep. There's a story, cited in community discussions and referenced across lore compilations, about a Terminator surviving a Titan stepping on him. A Titan, the smallest class of Titan, a warhound, weighs approximately 400 tons. The largest, an Imperator, weighs several thousand tons and stands taller than a skyscraper. These are god machines. They step on things and those things cease to exist. And yet, according to the lore, a Terminator survived this. The armor held. The Marine inside was injured, bones broken, organs ruptured, but he lived. The ceramite shell that encased him absorbed an impact that should have liquefied everything within into a thin paste spread across the ground. This is not how physics works. This is not how engineering works. This is not how pressure distribution across surface area works. But it's absolutely how 40K works. The official explanation is that Space Marine armor incorporates redundancies upon redundancies. Secondary systems back up primary systems. Tertiary systems back up secondary systems. The machine spirit, whatever it actually is, fights to keep the armor functional long past the point where rational engineering says it should fail. The practical explanation is that Games Workshop wants Space Marines to survive spectacular set pieces because spectacular set pieces sell miniatures and novels. The Terminator needed to survive because the story required him to survive. Both explanations are probably true. This is the duality that makes 40K special. On one hand, the lore demands that you take it seriously. There are 10,000 years of history. There are theological debates about the nature of the Emperor. There are economic systems and supply chains, and bureaucratic nightmare hierarchies running a million worlds. On the other hand, the armor just survives impossible impacts because the narrative requires it. That's not engineering. That's the machine spirit looking at the laws of physics and saying, no. And you know what? I respect it. I respect the audacity of a lore team that includes detailed technical specifications about ceramite heat conductivity and also includes durability feats that violate those specifications whenever the drama demands. The commitment to both the serious and the absurd is what makes 40K feel alive. Any universe can be grimdark. Any universe can be silly. 40K is both, simultaneously, without apology. So where does this leave you? You came here because you'd absorbed 40K lore from YouTube videos and wikis. Maybe you were a Space Marine 2 player who got pulled into the lore by the game's excellent presentation. Maybe you were an existing fan frustrated with GW's inconsistent writing. Either way, you wanted answers. You wanted to know what was actually canon versus what was zombie knowledge shambling forward from obsolete sources. Here's what you now know. The fixed helmet claim for Mark II and Mark III armor is dead. It was retconned when Forge World launched the Horus Heresy game system in 2012. The miniature kits have articulated helmets. The sourcebooks don't mention any restriction. The Black Library novels depict Marines in these patterns turning their heads. Anyone telling you otherwise is citing sources that haven't been accurate for over a decade. The molecular bonding studs are rivets, not ablative armor. They're attachment points for additional ceramite plating, developed as field repairs during the Heresy when supply lines collapsed and armorers had to improvise with whatever materials they had. The concentration on the left shoulder isn't aesthetic. It's because the left side takes the most fire during advance. This is confirmed in official Forge World and Warhammer community sources. Power armor being a sacred relic is directly contradicted by Primaris mass production. Call manufactured Mark X armor on an industrial scale for 10,000 years. Both narratives exist in official publications. Neither can be dismissed. GW simply published contradictory information and left fans to reconcile it, or to accept that the contradiction is intentional. Scout armor isn't power armor. It's Imperial carapace armor, the same class worn by inquisitorial stormtroopers. The black carapace is the threshold between scout and full battle brother. Without it, a human cannot interface with true power armor. Centurion warsuits are exoskeletons worn over power armor, not separate armor types. The Marine inside can dismount and fight in standard armor as the tactical situation demands. Grey Knights wear Aegis armor, an unnumbered pattern with psychic wards that operates outside the standard Mark progression because it was developed in secret for demon hunting. Mark IX is classified. The gap in the numbering exists, is acknowledged, and is not explained. Don't ask too many questions. And Terminator armor can survive things that should be physically impossible, because sometimes the lore prioritizes awesome moments over consistent physics. You're now equipped with knowledge that most 40K content doesn't provide. You can spot when a video or wiki article is repeating dead information. You can cite specific sources when someone challenges your claims. You know which contradictions are GW's fault and which are fan misunderstanding. The next time someone in a comment section confidently declares that Mark III Marines couldn't turn their heads, you know exactly what sourcebook proves them wrong. The next time someone insists the studs are a blade of armor, you can explain why they're incorrect and cite the left shoulder clustering detail that only makes sense if the studs are attachment points. The next time someone complains about power armor inconsistency, you can explain that they're not wrong. GW genuinely published contradictory lore, and acknowledging that isn't fan error, it's accurate criticism. That's the difference between absorbing whatever the algorithm feeds you and actually understanding the material. That's the difference between being the fan who gets corrected and being the fan who does the correcting. Games Workshop can't write consistent lore. The wikis perpetuate corpse lore. Most 40K content creators unknowingly spread misinformation because they researched from sources that were accurate 20 years ago. But not you. Not anymore. You know what's actually canon. Go forth and deploy that knowledge. Be insufferable about it in the best possible way. Cite your sources. Accept no zombie lore. And remember, the Inquisition is always watching. They probably aren't, but paranoia is very on brand for 40K. And if they are watching, they appreciate that you didn't speculate too hard about Mark IX. Subscribe for more content like this. We'll continue hunting zombie lore, putting contradictions on trial, and making sure you're never the one embarrassed in a comment section. The Emperor protects, but only if you know what you're talking about.